The worst mistake I ever made started with a swipe I was never supposed to make. That was the thought running through my head as I locked myself inside the tiny bathroom of my college dorm room, holding my phone like it contained a secret capable of changing my entire life. Outside the door, I heard my roommate's familiar voice followed by 2 quick knocks. "Mason, are you planning to move in there?" Caleb Bennett asked with a laugh. "You have been in there for almost 15 minutes. I looked at my reflection in the mirror and tried to sound casual. "Give me another minute." "That is exactly what you said 5 minutes ago." I smiled despite myself. "I will survive," I answered. "That is what worries me." His footsteps slowly disappeared back into our shared room, leaving me alone with the decision I still could not believe I was making. 3 days earlier, my friend Olivia had convinced me to download a dating app after listening to me complain for the 100th time that college was almost over and I had never seriously dated anyone. She insisted I was overthinking everything. I insisted I was perfectly happy focusing on classes. She rolled her eyes, grabbed my phone, and downloaded the app before I could stop her. "You do not have to meet anyone," she had said. "Just see who is out there." I agreed on one condition. No real name. No obvious photos. No details that would let anyone from campus recognize me. Living in a dorm meant rumors traveled faster than Wi-Fi, and I had no interest in becoming the latest conversation during lunch. So I created the most anonymous profile possible. My picture showed only the side of my face beside a lake during sunset. My name became simply M. My profile mentioned hiking, sketching landscapes, and loving old bookstores but avoided every detail that could identify me. I expected nothing to happen. Instead, less than 24 hours later, I matched with someone named C. His profile was just as mysterious as mine. One picture showed him wearing a baseball cap that covered most of his face while standing beside a mountain trail. Another displayed only his hands holding a coffee mug. His short biography made me laugh. Immediately, it read, "I can cook breakfast better than dinner, and I always lose arguments with my smoke alarm." I remembered smiling at the screen before typing my first message. "So your smoke alarm has a winning record?" His reply arrived less than a minute later. "It has not lost since freshman year." Somehow that tiny exchange became a conversation that lasted almost 3 hours. We talked about favorite movies, impossible professors, terrible cafeteria food, and the strange comfort of late-night campus walks after everyone else had gone to sleep. Nothing felt forced. Every answer led naturally to another question until I completely forgot I was speaking with a stranger. "Mason," Caleb's voice interrupted my thoughts from outside the bathroom once again. "If you are hiding snacks in there, at least save some for me." I laughed before unlocking the door. Caleb stood in the middle of our room wearing gray sweatpants and an old university sweatshirt, balancing 2 takeout containers in one hand. "I picked up dinner," he said. "I figured you would forget to eat again. You know me too well." That is what happens after sharing a dorm room for almost 2 years. He handed me one of the containers before sitting at his desk. As I placed my phone face down beside my plate, I noticed Caleb quietly glance toward it for only a second before looking away with an unreadable smile. I assumed he was simply curious why I had suddenly become so protective of my phone. What I did not know was that somewhere inside the same dorm room, only a few feet away, someone else was also hiding a dating app, smiling at messages from a stranger, and wondering why talking to one mysterious person already felt strangely like coming home. The next few days settled into a rhythm that felt strangely comforting and unexpectedly exciting. Every morning, Caleb and I hurried across campus with coffee in our hands, complaining about upcoming assignments while pretending we had our lives completely under control. Every evening, we returned to the same small dorm room, argued over whose turn it was to take out the trash, and laughed at whatever ridiculous story had happened during class. Then, after Caleb fell asleep or disappeared into the study lounge down the hall, I picked up my phone and found myself waiting for another message from C. It became the quiet highlight of every night. Our conversations drifted far beyond favorite movies and cafeteria food. We talked about childhood dreams, embarrassing freshman year memories, family traditions, and the strange pressure of trying to figure out who we wanted to become after graduation. Somehow, talking to someone whose face I had never fully seen felt easier than talking to almost anyone else. One evening, C. asked a question that caught me completely off guard. "What is the first thing people usually misunderstand about you?" I stared at the screen for nearly a minute before answering honestly. They think I am confident because I joke around a lot. Really, I just do not want anyone to notice when I am nervous. 3 little dots appeared almost immediately. That sounds familiar. I smiled without realizing it. Your turn. His reply came only seconds later. People think I always know exactly what I am doing. The truth is that I spend half my life hoping nobody notices I am making things up as I go. I laughed quietly, earning a confused glance from Caleb across the room. He was sitting at his desk pretending to study for a communications exam, but I noticed him smile when he heard me laughing. Good news? He asked casually. I locked my phone before answering. Just something funny online. Caleb nodded, although his eyes lingered on my phone for a brief second longer than usual. Glad somebody is making you laugh. The following afternoon, Olivia found me outside the student union eating lunch between classes. So, she said with a grin, how is mysterious stranger number 1? I nearly dropped my sandwich. Keep your voice down. She laughed. That well, huh? I tried to hide my smile, but failed immediately. He is actually really easy to talk to. Olivia leaned forward with obvious curiosity. Have you seen his face? Not completely. Real name? No. School? Maybe. She blinked. Maybe. I shrugged. He talks about professors and campus life, but nothing specific. Olivia laughed. You realize you could be talking to someone who sits 2 rows behind you in class. I shook my head. The campus has thousands of students. Exactly, she replied with a playful smile. Or maybe it is someone much closer. I rolled my eyes, convinced she was only teasing me. That evening, Caleb suggested we order pizza instead of eating cafeteria food again. While we waited for delivery, we played an old video game we had both loved since freshman year. Every time one of us lost, the winner got to choose the next song playing through the small speaker on Caleb's desk. Somewhere between laughter, terrible singing, and friendly competition, my phone buzzed on the bed behind me. Caleb glanced toward the sound at exactly the same moment I did. Popular tonight? He asked. Not really, I answered too quickly. He smiled in that calm, unreadable way he sometimes had before looking back at the television. Later, after Caleb finally went to shower, I unlocked my phone. Had sent only one message. You know what I like most about talking to you? I felt my heartbeat quicken as I typed. What? His answer appeared almost immediately. You make ordinary days feel like somebody is actually listening. I read the sentence 3 times before smiling to myself. At that exact moment, I heard Caleb begin quietly humming the very same old song that C had told me earlier was his favorite to play whenever he needed to clear his mind after a long day. I froze for only a second before shaking off the strange coincidence, telling myself that college students probably shared the same playlists more often than I realized. Still, for reasons I could not explain, that familiar melody stayed with me long after the conversation ended. By the beginning of October, my life had quietly divided itself into 2 completely different worlds that somehow revolved around the same campus. During the day, I shared everything with Caleb. We rushed across the quad carrying coffee before morning lectures, borrowed each other's hoodies without asking, argued over whose playlist deserved to control the speakers in our dorm room, and stayed awake before exams pretending we were studying while actually talking about anything except school. At night, after the lights in our room grew dim and the campus settled into silence, I found myself reaching for my phone to talk with C. The strange part was that both relationships gave me the same feeling of comfort, even though one belonged to real life and the other existed behind a screen. One evening, Caleb left early to meet classmates for a group project, leaving me alone in our dorm room for the first time all week. As soon as the door closed, my phone buzzed. Long day? C asked. I smiled immediately. You have no idea. Tell me anyway. That simple reply somehow made me laugh. I stretched out across my bed and began describing everything that had happened, from the professor who accidentally dismissed the wrong class to the vending machine that refused to accept my dollar bill 3 different times. C responded with the kind of humor that always felt effortless. Before long, we were exchanging embarrassing stories from freshman year, and I admitted how nervous I had been moving into the dorm because I had never shared a room with anyone before. Lucky roommate, C replied. Mine snores whenever he falls asleep before midnight. I laughed out loud. Mine steals my fries every chance he gets. 3 dots appeared almost immediately. Maybe he thinks you never finish them. I stopped smiling for a second. Caleb had used almost those exact words the previous week after taking fries from my plate in the student center. I stared at the message before shaking my head. Plenty of roommates joked about food. It was hardly unusual. Still, the coincidence stayed with me longer than I wanted to admit. Later that night, Caleb returned carrying 2 cups of hot chocolate from the campus cafe. Peace offering, he announced. The group project ran late. I accepted the cup with a grateful smile. You remembered I like extra whipped cream. He shrugged as though it were obvious. Of course I remembered. We sat quietly by the window while rain tapped softly against the glass. Caleb scrolled through something on his phone, smiling every now and then before quickly locking the screen whenever I looked his way. I noticed the habit because I had started doing exactly the same thing. The thought made me laugh under my breath. What is so funny? Caleb asked. Nothing. That sounded like a suspicious nothing. Maybe I was thinking about Olivia trying to convince me to join every campus club before graduation. Caleb chuckled. She has probably already made a spreadsheet. We both laughed, and for a moment, everything felt perfectly ordinary again. The following afternoon, I received another message from C while walking between classes. If you could relive one ordinary day from college, which one would you choose? I answered without thinking. The first night my roommate and I stayed awake talking until sunrise because neither of us could sleep in a new place. C did not respond for almost 2 minutes, longer than usual. Then one simple message appeared. I think that sounds like the beginning of a really important friendship. I smiled at the screen, unaware that only a few yards away, Caleb had just slipped his own phone back into his pocket after sending that exact message before quietly watching me smile from across the campus lawn. The small coincidences should have made me suspicious much sooner, but when you trust someone, your mind naturally searches for ordinary explanations before it considers extraordinary ones. That was exactly what happened to me. Every new conversation with C somehow made my friendship with Caleb feel even more meaningful, yet I still believe they were 2 completely different people. One rainy Thursday evening, I stayed behind after my afternoon design class to finish a project in the computer lab. Caleb had texted me earlier that he was meeting classmates to prepare for an upcoming presentation, so I expected to spend the evening alone. Around 7 o'clock, my phone buzzed. C had sent a message. How is your project going? I smiled while stretching my tired shoulders. Better now that I finally convinced my software to stop crashing. His reply came immediately. I knew you would figure it out. You always do. I paused for a moment. You sound very confident for someone who has never actually seen me working. 3 dots appeared before his answer arrived. Sometimes you can tell what kind of person someone is without watching them. That sentence stayed with me as I packed my backpack and walked across campus through the cool autumn air. When I finally reached our dorm room, Caleb was already there, sitting cross-legged on his bed reading a communications textbook. You made it, he said with an easy smile. I thought your project might keep you there all night. I almost let it. I laughed while dropping my backpack onto the floor. Caleb stood and walked toward the small kitchenette we shared with the neighboring room. I made ramen, he said. I even remembered not to overcook yours this time. I looked at him with mock surprise. Miracles really do happen. We ate dinner while talking about classes, weekend plans, and the upcoming fall festival that the university hosted every October. It was one of the biggest events on campus, filled with live music, food trucks, student clubs, and local artists. Olivia already volunteered me to help at one of the booths, I admitted. Caleb smiled. She volunteered me too. Of course she did. We both laughed. Later that night, Caleb stepped into the hallway to take a phone call from his older sister, leaving me alone in the room. My phone buzzed almost immediately. Another message from C. What is your favorite thing about college? I answered without much thought. Honestly, my roommate. I stared at the screen after sending the message, wondering whether that answer sounded strange. A full minute passed before C replied. You must be lucky. I smiled. I really am. He always remembers when I forget to eat. He knows exactly how I take my coffee, and somehow he can tell when I have had a bad day before I even say anything. My phone remained silent for several moments. Finally, another message appeared. Do you think he knows how important he is to you? The question caught me completely off guard. I looked toward the dorm room door where Caleb was still talking quietly in the hallway. Probably not, I typed honestly. Some things are easier to write than to say. When Caleb returned a few minutes later, he seemed unusually thoughtful. He sat down at his desk, unlocked his phone for a brief second, smiled almost imperceptibly, then slipped it into his pocket before looking over at me. "Hey," he said casually, "random question." "Sure. Do you think people sometimes miss what is right in front of them because they are too busy looking somewhere else?" I laughed softly. That is a strangely philosophical question for 10 o'clock on a Thursday. Caleb smiled but did not answer. Instead, he picked up the empty ramen bowls and carried them toward the sink. I watched him disappear into the kitchenette, completely unaware that the same question had reached me twice that evening from what I still believed were two different people. The university's annual autumn festival arrived on one of those bright October afternoons when the entire campus seemed determined to forget about homework for a few hours. Colorful banners stretched between buildings. Food trucks filled the air with the smell of fresh barbecue and cinnamon pastries. Live music echoed across the main lawn, and students wandered from booth to booth carrying cups of hot apple cider. Olivia had volunteered both Caleb and me to help decorate the student activities tent before the festival officially opened, which meant we spent the entire morning hanging lights, arranging tables, and laughing whenever one of us accidentally tangled another string of decorations. "I am never volunteering again," Caleb joked while trying to untwist a bundle of extension cords. "You said that last year," I reminded him. "And the year before that." He laughed. Apparently I never learn. Around lunchtime, my phone vibrated inside my pocket. It was another message from C. "Do you have any plans this afternoon?" I smiled without thinking. "Helping at the fall festival." Three dots appeared almost immediately. Interesting. I was thinking about going too. My heart skipped slightly. We had been talking every day for nearly 3 weeks, yet neither of us had suggested meeting in person. Somehow the mystery had become strangely comfortable. Before I could overthink it, another message appeared. Maybe it is finally time. I stared at the screen for several seconds. "Are you asking to meet?" "Yes." My pulse quickened. How would we even recognize each other? "Simple," he replied. "I will wear a blue scarf." I smiled. "I actually own one." "Perfect. Meet me beside the old campus fountain at 4 o'clock. I agreed before I had enough time to become nervous. For the rest of the afternoon, I found it almost impossible to concentrate. Every student walking past suddenly looked like they could be C. Every unfamiliar face made me wonder whether I had already walked by the person who somehow knew me better than almost anyone else. Olivia noticed my distracted expression almost immediately. "You look like someone waiting for exam results," she teased. I leaned closer and lowered my voice. "I am meeting him today." Her eyes widened. "Finally. I have absolutely no idea what I am doing." She smiled warmly. "Just be yourself. That seems to be working so far." Meanwhile, Caleb spent most of the afternoon helping organize the outdoor stage. Every now and then I caught him checking his phone before slipping it quickly back into his jacket pocket. Once or twice he looked as though he wanted to say something, but each time another volunteer interrupted the moment. Around 3:30, I told Caleb I was going to walk around the festival for a little while before my shift resumed. He nodded with an unusually thoughtful smile. "I actually need to meet someone too," he said quietly. "Really?" "Yeah." He hesitated just long enough for me to notice. "Wish me luck." I laughed. "Good luck. You too." He answered almost automatically before looking mildly surprised that he had said it. At 3:55, I arrived beside the old stone fountain in the center of campus wearing my blue scarf, trying to appear much calmer than I actually felt. Students filled the sidewalks in every direction while music drifted through the cool afternoon air. I looked around, searching every approaching face, wondering which stranger had somehow become the brightest part of my evenings. Then, across the crowded plaza, I noticed someone standing completely still with the same shade of blue wrapped around his neck. It was Caleb. He looked directly at me with an expression of absolute disbelief, his eyes slowly dropping from my face to the blue scarf I was wearing before lifting his own phone from his pocket at the exact same moment mine vibrated with a new message. For a moment, the entire festival disappeared. The music faded into the background, conversations became distant noise, and all I could hear was the notification from my phone arriving at exactly the same time Caleb looked down at his own screen. My hands suddenly felt cold despite the warm afternoon sunlight. Caleb's blue scarf moved gently in the breeze, matching the one wrapped around my neck almost perfectly. Neither of us spoke. We simply stared at each other across the crowded plaza as though our minds were trying to reject the conclusion that had already become impossible to ignore. My phone vibrated again. Without taking my eyes off Caleb, I unlocked the screen. One new message from C appeared. "I think I finally see you." My heart skipped so hard that I almost laughed from pure disbelief. Slowly, almost automatically, I looked back up. Caleb was still holding his phone. A second later, I watched him type something. Another vibration reached my hand. "Please tell me I am not imagining this." I swallowed hard before typing only 2 words. "Blue scarf." Caleb glanced at his screen, closed his eyes for a brief second, then looked back at me with an expression somewhere between panic and relief. We stood frozen for several more seconds while students walked between us carrying food and laughing, completely unaware that 2 lives had just collided in the middle of the busiest place on campus. Then something unexpected happened. Caleb quietly lowered his phone, took one hesitant step backward, and shook his head almost imperceptibly. Before I could call his name, he turned and disappeared into the moving crowd. "Caleb," I shouted instinctively, but my voice was swallowed by live music from the nearby stage. I hurried after him, weaving between groups of students, yet every time I thought I caught sight of his charcoal jacket, another crowd blocked my view. Within less than a minute, he was gone. I stopped beside a row of food trucks, breathing harder than I expected, my phone still clutched tightly in my hand. Another message appeared. "I am sorry." I stared at those 3 words until the screen blurred slightly. I typed back immediately. "Why did you leave?" There was no reply. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Finally, another message appeared. "Because I was afraid that if I stayed, I would ruin the best friendship I have ever had." I leaned against a nearby bench, unable to think of the right response. Everything suddenly made sense. Every familiar joke, every shared song, every strangely specific question, every coincidence I had dismissed. It had been Caleb all along. Olivia eventually found me standing alone beside the fountain. One look at my face told her everything. "You met him?" she asked quietly. I nodded without speaking. "Did it go badly?" I let out a nervous laugh that surprised even me. "The problem is not that it went badly." She waited patiently. "The problem is that it was Caleb." Her eyes widened before she whispered, "Your roommate?" I nodded again. Olivia blinked several times before finally saying, "I definitely did not predict that." "Neither did I." I looked down at my phone once more. And now I do not know how I am supposed to walk back into our dorm room and pretend none of this happened. That evening I returned to our room later than usual. Caleb was already there, sitting quietly at his desk with an open textbook that he clearly was not reading. He looked up the moment I entered. For a few endless seconds, neither of us knew whether to speak, apologize, laugh, or simply act as though the afternoon had never happened. Finally, Caleb managed a small, uncertain smile. "Hi, Mason." It sounded exactly like every ordinary greeting he had ever given me, yet somehow it carried the weight of every message we had ever exchanged without knowing who was really on the other side of the screen. The days that followed felt stranger than any final exam I had ever taken because there was no right answer waiting at the end. Caleb and I continued sharing the same dorm room, the same classes, and the same routines, but now every ordinary moment carried the memory of that afternoon beside the fountain. Neither of us mentioned the dating app. Neither of us admitted that we had been the mysterious person behind the screen. We simply acted as though the discovery had been quietly packed away somewhere neither of us intended to open again. At least that was what we pretended. Caleb started spending more evenings at the library, telling me he needed extra time to prepare for graduation projects. I believed him until I noticed he always came back with books he never opened. I began volunteering for longer shifts at the Student Arts Center, convincing myself I wanted to stay busy when the truth was much simpler. It hurt to sit across from Caleb pretending that the messages we had shared belonged to strangers instead of us. The silence between us slowly became louder than any conversation we had ever had. One evening I returned to the dorm room, carrying takeout from our favorite diner. Caleb was sitting at his desk, headphones around his neck, staring out the window instead of studying. "I brought burgers," I said, trying to sound normal. He smiled politely. "Thanks." We ate together in near silence. Usually we would have argued about sports, joked about professors, or debated which movie deserved another rewatch. That night the only sounds came from the rain tapping softly against the window and the occasional rustle of paper from someone's notebook. Halfway through dinner, Caleb quietly pushed the carton of fries toward me. You always finish these, he said. I looked at the fries, remembering the message from C weeks earlier about my roommate stealing them because he knew I never finished them. A small smile appeared before disappearing just as quickly. Caleb noticed. What? He asked gently. I shook my head. Nothing. But it was not nothing. Every ordinary habit had suddenly become evidence that the person I had trusted online had been sitting 3 feet away all along. That weekend, Olivia invited me to a coffee shop off campus after noticing how distracted I had become. She listened patiently while I explained everything that had happened since the festival. When I finally finished, she rested both hands around her mug and asked the simplest question imaginable. Do you miss the messages? I answered without hesitation. Every night. Do you miss Caleb? I laughed softly. That is the problem. I miss both of them, and they are the same person. Olivia smiled with surprising kindness. Maybe you were looking at it the wrong way. I frowned. How? You never lost the person behind the messages. He is still your roommate. Her words stayed with me all afternoon. Back at the dorm, Caleb had already left for another long evening at the library. The room felt unusually empty without him. I sat on my bed and unlocked the dating app for the first time since the festival. Every conversation was still there, stretching back through weeks of late-night honesty, shared jokes, favorite songs, and quiet confessions. I reread the message where C had said I made ordinary days feel like someone was actually listening. Then I found the one where I had admitted my roommate was my favorite part of college without realizing I was saying it directly to him. My chest tightened with equal parts embarrassment and warmth. Finally, I opened our conversation one last time and typed a message, even though I had no idea whether Caleb would ever answer. I am not upset because you were my roommate. I am upset because after knowing it was you, pretending we are only strangers online hurts more than I expected. I stared at the screen for several long seconds before pressing send. The message disappeared into the conversation, and somewhere else on campus, another phone quietly lit up inside the backpack of the one person I hoped would finally stop running from the same truth we had both been carrying all semester. My phone remained silent for almost 2 hours after I sent the message. I told myself not to stare at the screen every few minutes. Yet somehow I still noticed every passing second. Outside the dorm window, autumn rain continued falling softly across the campus, covering the sidewalks with shimmering reflections beneath the streetlights. I tried reading, then sketching, then organizing my desk, but nothing kept my attention for long. Every thought eventually returned to Caleb. Around 9 that evening, I heard the familiar sound of our dorm room door opening. Caleb stepped inside carrying his backpack, his hair slightly damp from the rain. He looked exhausted, but the moment our eyes met, I knew something had changed. Neither of us spoke immediately. He quietly placed his backpack beside his desk before taking his phone from the front pocket. The screen was still glowing. He had read my message. After a long silence, Caleb walked toward my side of the room and stopped a few feet away. I did not know how to answer, he admitted softly. I looked up at him. You do not have to answer perfectly. He smiled sadly. That is exactly the problem. I have been trying to find perfect words ever since the festival. I stood slowly, unsure whether the conversation would heal everything or make the distance between us even greater. Caleb let out a slow breath before continuing. When I saw you wearing that blue scarf, I was happy for 1 second. He laughed quietly at himself. Then I became terrified. Why? I asked gently. Because suddenly you were not just the person I talked to every night. You were also the roommate who had become the best part of my college life. He lowered his eyes. I thought if I admitted everything, I might lose both. His honesty made every confusing week suddenly understandable. I was afraid too, I confessed. After the festival, I kept wondering whether every message had been a mistake. Caleb immediately shook his head. Never. His answer came so quickly that neither of us missed it. Not one conversation. Not one joke. Not one late-night message. He smiled with quiet warmth. Those were the most honest conversations I have had in years. The room fell silent again, but this time the silence felt lighter instead of painful. Rain continued tapping against the window, while distant laughter echoed from somewhere down the hallway. College life carried on outside our door, completely unaware that 2 people were finally saying the things they had hidden for weeks. Caleb reached into his pocket and unlocked his phone. There was one message I almost sent a dozen times. He looked at the screen before reading it aloud. I think I started liking you before I ever knew we matched online. I felt my heartbeat quicken. Really? He nodded. The app just made it easier to say things I was too nervous to say face to face. I laughed softly. I guess I did the same thing. We both smiled, realizing how much time we had spent searching for courage when it had been sitting only a few feet away all along. Caleb slipped his phone back into his pocket before looking at me with the same calm expression that had always made our dorm room feel like home. Can I ask you one more question? Of course. If we had never downloaded that app, do you think we still would have ended up here? I thought about our first night as roommates, the shared meals, late-night conversations, inside jokes, borrowed hoodies, forgotten assignments, and every ordinary moment that had quietly built something much deeper than friendship. Then I smiled. Maybe it just would have taken us longer. Caleb laughed with visible relief. I think you are right. Neither of us rushed to define what came next. Instead, we pulled our desks together to finish homework we had been avoiding all evening, talking naturally again for the first time since the festival. Somewhere between textbooks, coffee, and comfortable conversation, I realized the app had never created our connection. It had simply revealed the truth that had been patiently growing inside one ordinary dorm room since the very first day we met. The following Saturday morning arrived with clear blue skies and the kind of crisp autumn air that made the entire campus feel lighter than it had all semester. For the first time in weeks, waking up in our shared dorm room no longer felt awkward. Caleb was already standing by the small coffee maker humming the same familiar song that had once made me suspicious long before I understood why. This time, instead of pretending not to notice, I laughed. He looked over his shoulder with a grin. What? Nothing, I answered. I just realized I finally know where that song came from. Caleb smiled knowingly before handing me my coffee exactly the way I liked it, with one packet of sugar and just enough cream to take away the bitterness. Some mysteries deserve to stay unsolved, he joked. This one did not. We spent the morning walking across campus without rushing anywhere in particular. The colorful leaves covering the sidewalks crunched beneath our shoes while students hurried toward football games, study sessions, and weekend activities. Everything looked exactly the same as it had the week before, yet somehow the entire university felt different simply because neither of us was hiding anymore. As we passed the old fountain where everything had unraveled, Caleb slowed his pace and smiled awkwardly. I still cannot believe I ran away. I laughed softly. You really did. He rubbed the back of his neck with quiet embarrassment. I replayed that moment in my head at least 100 times. So did I. We stood there for a few seconds before Caleb looked at me with a warmth that no longer needed the protection of a phone screen. Maybe we should replace that memory with a better one. I would like that. Instead of lingering, we continued toward the small diner just beyond the edge of campus, where we had eaten countless late breakfasts over the past 2 years. The waitress greeted us with her usual cheerful smile. The roommates are back, she said while handing us menus she already knew we would barely open. Caleb laughed. You already know our orders. That is why I like having regular customers. We ordered our usual breakfasts, but the conversation felt completely new. We no longer needed to avoid certain topics or pretend the late-night messages had belonged to strangers. Caleb admitted he had downloaded the dating app after encouragement from his older sister, who insisted that hiding from every possibility guaranteed nothing would ever change. I confessed that Olivia had practically stolen my phone to create my profile, because she was tired of hearing me insist I was too busy for dating. We both laughed at how two stubborn friends had unknowingly pushed us toward each other. Halfway through breakfast, Caleb reached into his pocket and placed his phone on the table. He opened the dating app one last time before sliding it toward me. I think it finished its job. I looked at the familiar conversations that had quietly changed both of our lives. Without saying anything, I opened my own phone and did the same. We smiled at each other before pressing the delete button together. There was no dramatic celebration, no audience, and no grand declaration. Just two college roommates sitting in a neighborhood diner, quietly choosing the real person across the table instead of the anonymous profile behind a screen. As we stepped back outside into the cool autumn sunshine, Caleb looked at me with an easy smile. So, he asked, would you like to go on an actual first date with me this weekend? I pretended to think about it for a moment before smiling. Only if you promise not to hide behind a blue scarf this time. Caleb laughed. The kind of genuine laugh I had heard almost every day since we became roommates. And together we continued walking across campus, finally understanding that the best match either of us had ever made was not created by an algorithm. It had quietly begun the day two strangers moved into the same dorm room and slowly became the place the other had always wanted to come home to. Our first real date happened the following Friday evening. Although if anyone had watched us from across the restaurant, they probably would have assumed we were simply two college roommates sharing another meal after class. That familiar comfort was exactly what made the evening so special. Nothing about being together felt forced, because we had already spent nearly 2 years learning each other's habits, favorite foods, and terrible jokes. The only thing that had changed was that neither of us needed to hide what those moments actually meant. Caleb arrived wearing the same charcoal jacket he always seemed to choose whenever he wanted to make a good impression. I laughed the moment I noticed it. "You planned that," I teased. He smiled sheepishly. "Maybe a little. You wore that jacket the first week we met." He looked surprised that I remembered. "You noticed?" Apparently, I noticed more than I realized. We spent dinner laughing about forgotten freshman memories, professors who insisted 8 o'clock classes built character, and the endless competition over whose turn it had been to clean our dorm room. Every story felt different now because we no longer had to ignore the feelings quietly growing underneath them. After dinner, we walked through the nearly empty campus beneath rows of glowing streetlights, while cool autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves. Students hurried toward the library. Football practice had already ended, and the campus that usually felt busy now seemed peaceful. Caleb slipped his hands into his jacket pockets before speaking. "Can I admit something embarrassing?" "Always." He laughed softly. "The first week we became roommates, I accidentally memorized your class schedule." I looked at him with mock surprise. "Accidentally?" "Fine," he admitted with a smile. "Not accidentally." "Why?" He shrugged. "Because I liked knowing when you would be back. The room never really felt complete until you came home." His quiet honesty made me smile in a way I could not hide. "You know something?" I replied. "Every time you stayed late studying, I always left the desk lamp on." Caleb looked over. "Really?" I told myself it was because the room looked too dark. I laughed quietly. The truth was that I never liked coming back to an empty room. We continued walking until we reached the small bench overlooking the campus lake, where students often gathered during warmer months. The water reflected the lights from nearby buildings, creating gentle ripples of gold across the surface. Caleb sat beside me, leaving just enough space to feel respectful, but close enough that the familiar distance between us no longer seemed necessary. "Do you ever think about how strange all of this is?" he asked. "Every day." An app introduced me to someone I had already been living with. I smiled. Maybe it was just trying to catch us up. Caleb laughed before looking out across the water. "I spent so much time hoping I would meet the right person that I never realized he had already borrowed my hoodies, eaten my fries, and beaten me at video games for almost 2 years. You forgot complaining about my alarm clock." "That too." We sat together in comfortable silence until my phone buzzed with a notification from the App Store suggesting new dating applications. I showed the screen to Caleb, and we both laughed. "A little late," he joked. I slipped the phone back into my pocket without another glance. "I think my search ended a while ago." Caleb smiled with quiet warmth, and as we walked back toward our dorm beneath a sky filled with bright autumn stars, I realized our first official date did not feel like the beginning of something unfamiliar. Instead, it felt like finally giving a name to the place where both our hearts had quietly belonged all along. The final semester of college arrived more quickly than either of us expected, bringing with it the familiar mixture of excitement, deadlines, and quiet uncertainty about what life would look like after graduation. Our dorm room, once filled with unopened boxes and awkward introductions, now carried the comfortable feeling of a place that had witnessed countless ordinary moments becoming unforgettable memories. The walls still held postcards from weekend trips, class schedules were taped beside the door, and the tiny coffee maker that had survived 2 years of nonstop use remained the first thing either of us reached for every morning. One Saturday, while sorting through old notebooks and textbooks we no longer needed, Caleb opened the top drawer of his desk and laughed to himself. "You have to see this," he said. He pulled out a folded piece of paper that looked worn around the edges. "Remember this?" I unfolded it carefully, and immediately recognized the roommate agreement we had filled out during our first week on campus. It listed simple promises that had seemed incredibly important at the time. Replace the toilet paper roll. Do not borrow headphones without asking. No loud music after midnight before exams. We both laughed at how serious we had been about rules that eventually became second nature. Then my eyes stopped on the final sentence written in Caleb's handwriting. Always tell the truth, even if it feels awkward. I looked up at him with a smile. We almost forgot our own rule. Caleb nodded thoughtfully. For a while we did. He sat beside me on the floor, surrounded by stacks of books waiting to be packed. I still think about how close we came to graduating without ever saying anything. I leaned back against the bed frame. Honestly, I thought keeping quiet was protecting our friendship. So did I, Caleb admitted. But I have learned something. I looked toward him. What is that? He smiled gently. Real friendship was never the thing we needed to protect. It was strong enough to survive the truth. His words settled quietly between us. Later that afternoon, we met Olivia for coffee near campus. The moment she saw us walking in together, she crossed her arms with an exaggerated smile. I would like everyone to remember that I was the one who convinced Mason to download that app. Caleb laughed. I think you deserve partial credit. Partial? She replied dramatically. Without me, the two of you would probably still be pretending to be mysterious strangers. We all laughed, knowing she was not entirely wrong. As the conversation continued, Olivia became unusually thoughtful. You know, she said, my favorite part of this whole story is that nothing fake ever brought you together. Caleb looked at her curiously. What do you mean? The app was only a doorway, she answered. Everything that mattered happened because you had already built trust long before either of you created a profile. Walking back to campus afterward, I realized she had perfectly described what had taken me months to understand. The late-night messages had been meaningful because they reflected the same kindness, patience, and humor that Caleb showed every day in real life. Nothing about him had changed. I had simply been given another way to see the person who had always been there. That evening we returned to our dorm room, carrying fresh coffee and a small box of donuts to celebrate finishing another round of final projects. As we sat side by side reviewing notes for the following week's exams, Caleb looked over with an easy smile. It is funny, he said. The app matched us in a few seconds. I laughed quietly. But becoming us took almost 2 years. Caleb nodded with complete certainty, and I would not change a single day of it. Looking around the room that had quietly become the beginning of our story, I realized he was absolutely right. The greatest moments in life are rarely built overnight. They grow patiently through shared mornings, borrowed hoodies, unfinished conversations, small acts of kindness, and the courage to finally recognize that the person you have been searching for has been sitting across the room all along. Graduation month arrived almost without warning, and suddenly every conversation on campus revolved around interviews, apartment leases, moving trucks, and the uncertain excitement of beginning life beyond college. Cardboard boxes slowly appeared around our dorm room, replacing the familiar clutter that had accumulated over 2 unforgettable years. Caleb spent one afternoon carefully wrapping framed photographs while I sorted through sketchbooks, notebooks, and countless small souvenirs that somehow carried entire memories inside them. Every object reminded us of a different chapter. The chipped coffee mug from our first finals week, the ticket stub from a campus concert, the blue scarf that neither of us had forgotten since the autumn festival. I picked it up and laughed quietly before handing it to Caleb. This almost ruined both of our lives. Caleb accepted it with an amused smile. Or maybe it saved them. I could not argue with that. A few days later, our university organized a senior celebration on the main lawn before graduation. Students gathered beneath white tents while professors shared stories about perseverance, friendship, and new beginnings. Families wandered across campus taking photographs beside blooming spring flowers, and the entire afternoon carried a feeling that every ending was quietly becoming the beginning of something else. Olivia found us standing near the old fountain where everything had changed months earlier. She looked from me to Caleb with a satisfied grin. I still expect a thank you card someday. Caleb laughed. You are never going to let us forget that, are you? Absolutely not. She smiled warmly before adding, although I am just happy neither of you let fear make your decisions forever. Her words stayed with me long after she walked away. That evening, Caleb and I decided to take one final walk around campus before graduation. Weekend filled every corner with visitors. We wandered through the quiet library courtyard, crossed the familiar brick pathways where we had hurried to morning classes, and stopped outside the freshman residence hall where our story had unknowingly begun. Caleb looked toward the building and smiled. "Do you remember how nervous we both were on move-in day?" I laughed. I thought sharing a room with a stranger would be the hardest part of college. Turns out sharing it with the right person changed everything. We continued walking until we reached the bench overlooking the small campus lake. Spring leaves had replaced the autumn colors that surrounded us during our first official date, yet the peaceful feeling remained exactly the same. Caleb sat beside me and looked out across the calm water. "I have been thinking about something," he said. "When people ask where we met after graduation, what are we going to tell them?" I smiled. "The truth." He looked at me curiously. "Which version?" I laughed softly. "All of it. We became roommates. We became best friends. We accidentally matched online. Then we finally admitted what had already been true for a long time." Caleb nodded thoughtfully. "That actually sounds better than any story I could have invented." As the sun slowly disappeared behind the campus buildings, my phone buzzed with one final notification from the dating app asking whether I wanted to restore my deleted profile. I smiled before dismissing it without another thought. Caleb noticed and raised an eyebrow. "Everything okay?" I slipped my phone back into my pocket. "Better than okay." He smiled, understanding without needing another explanation. Together we watched the evening light reflect across the lake, realizing that sometimes life does not bring the right person into your world through dramatic coincidences alone. Sometimes it quietly places them beside you every ordinary day until one unexpected moment finally gives both of you the courage to recognize what has been there from the very beginning. And that quiet realization becomes the greatest new beginning of all. Graduation morning began with golden sunlight pouring through the dorm room window, illuminating the same small space that had quietly changed both of our lives. Cardboard boxes lined the walls. Our desks were nearly empty, and only a few personal belongings remained scattered around the room. It no longer looked like the place where two nervous freshmen had first met, yet somehow it still felt exactly like home. Caleb stood by the window, adjusting his graduation gown, while pretending not to notice that I had been watching him for the past several seconds. "What?" he asked with an amused smile. I laughed softly. "I was just thinking about how strange this all is. Graduating. Everything." I looked around the room one last time. "We came here as complete strangers." Caleb nodded. "And now leaving almost feels harder than arriving." We walked across campus together beneath rows of blooming trees, surrounded by proud families taking photographs and classmates celebrating the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Every familiar building carried a memory. The library where we studied until midnight. The student center where we shared countless meals. The old fountain where one unexpected afternoon forced both of us to stop hiding from the truth. During the ceremony, we sat only a few seats apart, exchanging quiet smiles whenever our eyes met. As names were announced and graduates crossed the stage, I realized the diploma in my hands represented far more than 4 years of classes. It represented every ordinary day that had slowly built an extraordinary connection. After the ceremony, our families gathered for photographs on the main lawn. My parents immediately noticed how naturally Caleb and I stood beside each other. His older sister laughed when she saw us still finishing each other's sentences. Olivia insisted on taking what she proudly called the real graduation picture, placing the two of us beside the old campus sign before reminding everyone that she had once convinced me to download a dating app one had never wanted in the first place. We all laughed because by then the story had become something joyful instead of awkward. Later that evening, after our families headed home, Caleb and I returned to the now nearly empty dorm room for one final visit before turning in our keys. The silence inside felt peaceful rather than sad. Caleb reached into the top drawer of his desk and pulled out 2 small items. One was the faded roommate agreement we had written during our first week. The other was the blue scarf that had accidentally revealed everything. He handed the scarf to me with a smile. "I think you should keep this." I shook my head. "Only if you keep the roommate agreement." He unfolded the paper and laughed quietly at the final promise written across the bottom. "Always tell the truth, even if it feels awkward." "Looks like we finally passed that test," he said. We locked the dorm room door for the last time and walked slowly across campus as the evening sky turned shades of orange and blue. Before leaving through the front gate, I looked back one final time at the place where our story had begun. I smiled, remembering the frightened student who had hidden inside a tiny bathroom, holding a phone and wondering whether downloading a dating app had been a mistake. He had been wrong. The greatest surprise was never the match itself. The greatest surprise was discovering that the person who understood me best had been sharing my ordinary days all along, patiently waiting for both of us to recognize that home was never a place, never an application, and never an accident. Home had always been the person walking beside me, and together we stepped forward into the future, knowing that the most meaningful chapter of our story was only just beginning.